On September 30th, 2025, something happened in the state of Florida that had never happened before. Not in 10 years. Not in 20. Not ever. Not in the modern history of the United States. Florida carried out its 13th execution in a single year. 13 people. 1 year, 1 state. The man who died that evening was 64 years old. His name was Victor Tony Jones. He had spent 32 years on death row, longer than most people spend in an entire career, longer than some people's whole adult lives. When the moment came, he was asked if he had any final words, any last thing he wanted to say to the world. Anything at all. He looked up and said 2 words. "No, sir," and then he was gone. Now, you might hear that and think, okay. A man was executed. He committed a crime. Justice was served. The end. But here is the thing about this story. It does not end there. In fact, the ending is not even the most interesting part. The most interesting part is everything that came before it. Everything the court records don't tell you in the first paragraph. Everything that was buried, quietly, carefully, for decades. Because Victor Tony Jones was not just a man on death row. He was also something else entirely. Something that the state of Florida itself had recently admitted. Something they had put in writing, signed, and stamped with an official seal. And once you find out what that is, and when you find out exactly when they admitted it, this story stops being simple. It stops being simple very quickly. Before we go any further, if this is your first time on this channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. We cover real stories told the right way. No fluff, no exaggeration. Just the truth. And sometimes the truth is more gripping than anything anyone could make up. Now, let's go back to where this story really begins. Not in a prison, not in a courtroom. In a small business, in Miami-Dade, Florida. On a cold morning in December 1990, Matilda and Jacob Nestor were the kind of people a neighborhood remembers. Matilda, everyone who loved her called her Dolly, was 66 years old. Jacob, whom friends knew as Jack, was 67. They had been together since high school. High school sweethearts who grew old together, who built a life together, who built a business together. Jack was an engineer, a skilled one. His shop made custom medical tools, precision instruments used by plastic surgeons across the state of Florida. These were not cheap products made in bulk. These were careful, handcrafted tools built for delicate procedures, the kind of work that requires patience and attention. Matilda was his right-hand person. She kept things running. She handled the business side, kept the shop organized, showed up every day. They were, by every account, good people, community people, the kind of couple that helps others without being asked. Their daughter, Irene Fisher, would later say that her parents were incredible human beings, and she meant it. In December of 1990, the Nestors hired a new employee. His name was Victor Tony Jones. He had just started. In fact, December 19th, the day everything changed, was only his second day on the job. 2 days. He had been working for them for 2 days. What happened inside that shop on that December morning shook the people who investigated it. It shook the first officers who arrived at the scene. It shook the jury that would hear about it 3 years later. A UPS delivery driver came by the building that morning. He leaned down to look through the mail slot in the door. Just a routine check, the kind delivery workers do when nobody answers. What he saw made him step back. He could see feet, legs, someone on the floor. He didn't wait. He ran to a neighbor, and together they called emergency services. When police arrived, they found the shop locked from the inside, and they found Victor Tony Jones sitting on a couch, alive, a wound on his forehead. The Nestors' wallets in his pockets, their keys, their money, their personal belongings, all of it right there on his person. Matilda and Jacob Nestor were both gone. The officers put Jones in the back of a squad car. He looked up and said, "The old man shot me." That was it. That was all he said before he stopped talking. He was taken to the hospital. He had a bullet wound to the forehead, a .22 caliber round, which had struck him but had not gone through. Jacob Nestor, even after being stabbed, had managed to reach for his pistol. He had fired 5 shots. One of them hit Jones. Then Jack collapsed. At the hospital, Jones spoke again, this time to a nurse. He told the nurse that he had killed the couple because they owed him money. That was the confession, not in a police room, not under questioning, casually, to a nurse in a hospital bed. The jury heard all of this in 1993. They heard the physical evidence. They heard the witness statements. They heard about the wallets, the keys, the confession. They voted to convict Victor Tony Jones on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed robbery. The vote for the death penalty was 10-2 for Matilda Nestor's murder. It was unanimous for Jacob, and Victor Tony Jones was sent to death row, where he would remain for the next 32 years. For most people following the story at the time, that was the conclusion. A man had done something terrible. He had been convicted and sentenced. The justice system had worked. Life moved on. But here is what almost no one knew, not the public, not many of the journalists covering the case, not even the jury that made the final call. There was a part of Victor Jones' story that had never been told in that courtroom. A part of his life that had been left out entirely, not because it wasn't real, not because there was no evidence, but because his own lawyers at the time of the trial had never brought it up. Something had happened to Victor Tony Jones long before December 1990, something that the state of Florida itself was responsible for, something so serious that decades later the government would officially apologize for it and set aside $20 million to compensate the people it had happened to, including Victor Jones. And the question, the real question at the center of this story, is not just what happened to him. The question is, what did Florida do with that information once they admitted it? Let's go back further, much further, long before Victor Jones was an employee at the Nestor's shop, long before 1990. Long before most people who would later make decisions about his life were even paying attention. We have to go back to when Victor Jones was a teenager, a young black boy growing up in Florida in the 1960s and early 1970s. At some point during those years, multiple times, in fact, a judge sent Victor Jones to a place called the Florida School for Boys at Okeechobee. It was a reform school. That is what it was officially called. A place where the court system sent boys who had gotten into trouble, boys who had broken rules, boys who, the system decided, needed to be corrected. The idea, at least the idea they advertised, was rehabilitation, teaching young people to do better. That was the idea. The reality was something different. Survivors who were at that school, men who are now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, have spent decades trying to get people to listen to what went on inside those walls. They described guards who beat boys with leather straps, hard, deliberately, not as a last resort, as a routine. They described solitary confinement for children, boys locked alone in dark rooms. They described racist treatment, slurs used casually, openly, by the people who were supposed to be in charge. And they described worse things still. Things that would take years, decades, before anyone in official power was willing to write the word abuse next to the name of that school. Victor Jones was sent to that school 4 separate times as a teenager. 4 times. His lawyers argued that what he experienced there damaged him, that it left marks not just on his body but on his mind, that it contributed to who he became as an adult, that the jury that sentenced him to death never heard any of this, because it was never presented to them. Courts dismissed these arguments for years, and then something changed. In 2024, the Florida State Legislature, not an advocacy group, not a nonprofit, not a protest movement, but the actual state legislature of Florida, passed a law. They voted unanimously. They created a $20 million fund, and they called what happened at the Okeechobee School and the Dozier School, the companion school in Marianna, a unique and shameful chapter in the history of this state. Those were the official words, written into law. And in January 2025, just 9 months before Victor Jones was executed, the Florida Attorney General's office sent him a letter, a formal letter. On official paper, it said, "Victor Tony Jones, you are recognized as a survivor of abuse committed by state officials at the Okeechobee School for Boys. You are eligible for compensation." The state of Florida had just officially told Victor Jones that he was a victim of the state of Florida itself. So what happened next? I want to know what you're thinking right now. Drop a comment below. Tell me, when you found out Florida officially recognized him as a victim 9 months before his execution, what was your first reaction? Because when I found out what happened next, I had to sit with it for a while. Keep watching, because what happened next is where this story takes a turn that even people who follow legal cases closely did not see coming. The state said he was a victim. They sent the money. They put it in his prison account. And then, 53 days later, the governor of Florida signed his death warrant. 53 days between "we acknowledge you were abused by our system and we are scheduling your execution." His attorneys immediately went to work. They went to the Florida Supreme Court. They argued that the letter, the official government letter recognizing Jones as an abuse survivor, was new evidence. Evidence that the original jury never heard. Evidence that, if they had heard it, might have changed their decision about the death penalty. It was, they said, the kind of thing that could make the difference between a death sentence and a life sentence. The Florida Supreme Court took the case, and then 5 of its 6 justices voted to deny the appeal. Their reasoning: Jones had known about the abuse since the 1970s. The fact that the government had now officially recognized it didn't make it new evidence. He could have brought it up before. That he didn't, or that his lawyers didn't, was not, in the court's view, a reason to stop the execution. One justice disagreed, just one. And then the case went to the United States Supreme Court. They looked at it, and they also said no. The legal system, every level of it, had spoken. September 30th, 2025 was going to happen. And on that evening, as the sun began to go down over northern Florida, approximately 60 people gathered outside Florida State Prison in Stark. They held signs. A pastor led them in prayer. Someone sang Amazing Grace. Inside, Victor Tony Jones ate his last meal: fried chicken, collard greens, sweet tea. He met with a spiritual advisor, and at 6:13 in the evening he was pronounced dead. Irene Fisher, the daughter of Matilda and Jacob Nestor, was inside the prison that night. She witnessed the execution. Afterwards, she said something that most people did not expect. She said she forgave him. She said watching him die was not an easy thing. She wished her parents could have gone as peacefully. She said, "I'm very happy on one end that it's over, and I'm sad also that someone else had to lose their life. 2 families, 2 stories, all of them connected to one day in December 1990, and to everything that came before it and after it. But there is still so much more to understand about this case, because the story of what happened inside the Okeechobee School for Boys is not just Victor Jones' story. It is the story of hundreds of men, boys really, some as young as 10 or 11 years old, who were sent to that school across several decades, and what they came out carrying with them. That story has been hidden for a long time, and it deserves to be told. Picture a school, not the kind you're thinking of. Not the kind with hallways full of laughter, or teachers who call your name from a list every morning. Picture something older, quieter, set far away from the nearest town, surrounded by flat Florida land where the horizon seems to go on forever. A place where boys were sent, not invited, sent by judges, by courts, by a system that had decided what to do with children who had gotten into trouble. The Florida School for Boys at Okeechobee opened in 1955. It was built because another school, one in the small panhandle town of Marianna, called the Duzia School for Boys, had run out of room. Too many boys, not enough space. So Florida built a second campus further south near the town of Okeechobee in the middle of the state. The idea, as always, was reform. That word reform means to fix, to reshape, to take something broken and make it whole again. That was the promise. Boys who arrived there had come from all kinds of places, small towns and big cities, poor families, broken homes. Boys whose fathers had left when they were young. Boys who had been left to figure things out on their own. Many of them had done things they shouldn't have done, minor things, some of them. Petty theft, running away, breaking a rule. The kind of mistakes that for children with money or connections often disappeared quietly. But for these boys, those mistakes had sent them here. One survivor, a man named Michael Anderson, was sent to Okeechobee for stealing a $3 shirt. $3. He was a child, and when he arrived at the Florida School for Boys, he was about to learn something that nobody had prepared him for. For years, for decades, the men who had been inside those schools stayed quiet. Not because nothing had happened, because they had been told very clearly what would happen if they ever said a word. One survivor recalled being told this directly. If you tell anyone, your parents, anyone, what happens in here, the punishment you receive next time will be 10 times worse. 10 times worse. And so they stayed silent. They grew up. They became men. Some of them went to war. Some of them raised children. Some of them built lives that looked perfectly normal from the outside. But on the inside, they were carrying something they could not put down. The memory stayed. One man, a 77-year-old Army veteran named Daniel Gaynor, was sent to the Dozier School at 13 years old for stealing a car. At the time he was arrested, he didn't even know how to drive. He served more than 20 years in the military. He survived combat. He came home, and he still could not talk about what happened to him at that school. Not until 2024. Over 50 years of silence. He said, "I was scarier there than I was in Vietnam, because in Vietnam I knew I could come back. But there, I didn't know whether I was coming back." That is a decorated combat soldier talking about a school for children. Let that sit for a moment. What survivors described, when they finally did speak, was a system of punishment that had nothing to do with education or correction. There was a room, not a classroom, not an office, a room, concrete walls, roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. Inside, along one wall, a metal army cot with a slight raised bar running across it, something to hold on to. Boys who broke rules, any rules, small or large, were brought to this room. They were shown a leather strap, wide, thick, reinforced down the middle. They were told to lie face down on the cot, to grip the bar, to turn their head toward the wall, to make no sound, and then they were beaten, approximately 20 times across the back of their body. The men who survived this describe it in ways that are difficult to hear, not because they are exaggerating, but because the details are so specific, so consistent, told by men who never met each other, in different states and different decades, that it becomes impossible to doubt them. One man described sound, the leather meeting skin. He said he can still hear it. Another described having the fabric of his clothes stuck to his skin afterward from what the beating had drawn. And then they were sent back to their dorms and told to act normal. The Okeechobee school was not identical to the one in Marianna, but the pattern was the same. At both schools, the boys who arrived were overwhelmingly poor. They came from families without money or legal power or connections. They were the children that the system could afford to mistreat, because no one was watching closely enough or willing to look. At Marianna, investigators would eventually find something that changed the entire conversation. In the years after the school finally closed in 2011, after more than a century of operation, a team of forensic scientists from the University of South Florida went to the campus to investigate stories that had been circulating for years. Stories about boys who had gone in and never come out. Boys listed as missing in the school's records. Boys whose families had never received a clear explanation. What they found on that campus was 55 unmarked graves. Some of the remains showed evidence of injuries consistent with blunt force, At least one set of remains belonged to a child listed as missing in the school's own records. The Okeechobee campus was searched, too. Cadaver dogs swept the area in 2015. No human remains were found there. But the Okeechobee land has never been fully excavated, and the school's records, the files that might tell us exactly what happened to every boy who was sent there, were routinely destroyed when a student turned 19. Victor Jones' records were destroyed. The state of Florida confirmed this. His records from the Okeechobee school, any official documentation of his time there, his punishments, his treatment, were gone. Now here is where this story gets complicated in a way that matters. For years, Victor Jones' lawyers argued that what happened to him at Okeechobee should have been heard by the jury that sentenced him to death. They argued that trial counsel, his original lawyers, had failed him, that they never properly investigated his background, that instead of telling the jury about the reform school, the trauma, the abuse, they told a different story entirely. They told the jury that Jones had been taken in by an aunt, that he'd been given a better life, that he'd had opportunities. Documents filed in his final appeal tell a different story. They describe a childhood marked by abandonment and neglect long before Okeechobee. They describe a boy who, when he got to that school, was beaten with the same leather strap that every other survivor has described, who witnessed things happening to other boys in the dormitory, things that boys were powerless to stop, who fought back just to protect himself and ended up in solitary confinement for it. And they describe a man who left that school carrying things no child should have to carry. All of this, every single bit of it, was left out of his trial. The jury that sentenced Victor Jones to death heard nothing about any of it. Nothing. His lawyers also raised something else, something that the courts had already looked at before, but that had not been fully resolved. Victor Jones had an IQ measured at below 75. Under a landmark decision by the United States Supreme Court, a person with an intellectual disability cannot be executed. That ruling, handed down in 2002, said that doing so constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Constitution. Jones' attorneys argued for years that he fell within that category, that he was intellectually disabled and should not be eligible for the death penalty at all. The courts rejected this argument multiple times. And this is where the story inside the story begins to emerge, because the question was not just whether Victor Jones was guilty. That had been decided in 1993. The question, the one that would follow him for 32 years, was about what the jury knew when they made their decision. A jury can only weigh what they are given. If they are not given the full picture, they cannot make a fully informed choice. And the jury that sentenced Victor Jones had been given an incomplete picture, not because the information didn't exist, because no one had put it in front of them. For most of the time Jones was on death row, these arguments went nowhere. Courts looked at the claims and turned them away, one by one, year by year. There is a principle in American law that says if you knew about something and didn't raise it in time, you lose the right to raise it later. It is called a procedural bar. And for Victor Jones it became a wall he could not get past. Yes, his lawyers said, he knew about the abuse, he lived it. But knowing about it personally is not the same as having a government institution officially confirm and document it. It is not the same as having the state of Florida write it into law and send you a formal letter recognizing you as a victim. That, they argued, was new. That was different. And if the courts would not agree to look at it, then every other question about his trial, his background, his mental capacity, stayed buried with it. The wheels of the legal system turned slowly, then ground to a halt, and Victor Jones waited. For 32 years he waited. And here is something worth pausing on, because it is easy, in a story like this, to focus only on the legal arguments and lose sight of the human reality underneath them. What does it feel like to spend 32 years in a single place, knowing that at any moment a governor could sign a piece of paper with your name on it? What does it do to a person, to a mind, to live inside that kind of uncertainty for 3 decades? We do not have a record of how Victor Jones spent those years. He did not write a memoir. He did not give many interviews. What we know of him, we know mostly through court documents and the accounts of lawyers who spoke on his behalf. But we know that he was described by those who met him as soft-spoken, quiet, a man who, by the end, said very little, a man who, when given the chance to say a final word to the world, chose not to take it. 2 words. That was all. No, sir. And now, with everything you know about the school, about the abuse, about the letter, and about the 53 days, we have to ask the question that his story demands. What exactly did the state of Florida know, and when did they know it? Because as it turns out, there is one more piece of this story that has not yet been told. A piece that involves the Attorney General's office, a set of public records, and a decision that Jones' lawyers called one of the most troubling moments in the entire case. That is what comes next. If this story has made you think, if you have questions, if you have something to say, drop a comment right now. Tell me what you think about what you've heard so far, because the conversation happening in the comments on this video matters. It is part of how stories like this one get the attention they deserve. Let's talk about what happened once the death warrant was signed. August 29, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis put his name on the document that scheduled Victor Jones' execution for September 30th. 53 days after the state had deposited his compensation check into his prison account. The moment that warrant was signed, everything changed. Jones' attorneys had a very short window to work with. In Florida, when a death warrant is signed, the legal process that follows moves fast. Hearings are compressed. Timelines are tight. Lawyers have days, sometimes just days, to file complex legal motions that might take months to prepare under normal circumstances. And in those compressed, frantic weeks, Jones' lawyers tried to get something important. They went to the Attorney General's office, the same office that had sent Jones the letter in January recognizing him as an abuse victim, and asked for the records. The public records related to his time at Okeechobee, the documentation that the state had used to verify his eligibility for compensation. Any files, any reports, anything in the government's possession about what had happened to Victor Jones as a boy. The Attorney General's office initially said, "We don't have any records. No records exist." Jones' lawyers pushed back. They knew records had to exist. The state had used something to verify his eligibility. They had made a determination. They had sent money. Decisions like that don't happen based on nothing. Eventually, some records did surface. But by then, the window was closing. The timeline was almost gone. And the courts, the Florida Supreme Court, and then the United States Supreme Court, were already in the process of saying no. The Florida Supreme Court ruled 5-1 against Jones. Their reasoning, laid out in a 23-page opinion, was this: the abuse at Okeechobee had happened 50 years ago. Jones had known about it his whole life. The fact that the state had now officially recognized it did not make it new evidence under the law. He had had decades to raise it. He hadn't. The door was closed. One justice dissented, Justice Jorge Labarga. He did not write a formal opinion. He simply registered his disagreement, quietly on the record. Just one voice out of 6. And then the case moved to Washington. The United States Supreme Court received the appeal on the weekend before the execution. Jones' lawyers filed a 36-page document laying out every argument they had: the intellectual disability, the incomplete trial, the state's own recognition of abuse, the question of whether it was fair, constitutional, to execute a man whose jury had never been told the full story of who he was or what had been done to him. The Supreme Court reviewed it and said nothing. They denied the appeal without comment. No explanation, no opinion, just no. And the date stood. September 30th, 2025 was going to happen. In the final days before the execution, voices from across the country began to speak up. The Florida Catholic Conference, the official body representing the Catholic Church in the state, sent a formal letter to Governor DeSantis asking him to commute Jones' sentence to life in prison without parole. The executive director of that organization wrote something that cut through the legal language and said what many people were quietly thinking. He asked, "How can it be that, with one hand, the state pays out compensation to men it abused and tortured as children, while at the same time, with its other hand, it executes one of those very victims?" He asked, to what degree did the abuse the state inflicted on this child contribute to the man he became? It was a question the legal system had declined to answer, and now there was no more time left to ask it. There were also protests outside the prison gates. 60 people, not a huge crowd, but a determined one, gathered on that Tuesday evening in Stark, Florida. They held candles. They held signs. A pastor stood among them. Someone began to sing. Inside, Victor Jones had eaten his last meal. He had met with a spiritual advisor. He had been prepared in whatever way a person can be prepared for such a thing. And the clock moved forward. But here is what this part of the story leaves us with, and it is not a comfortable place to sit. There is no version of this story that does not contain something painful for everyone involved. Matilda and Jacob Nestor were real people. They were not symbols or arguments in a legal brief. They were a husband and wife who went to work one December morning and never came home. They had a daughter who loved them and who has spent 35 years living with what happened. And Victor Tony Jones was also a real person, a man who had done a terrible thing, and a man who had also had terrible things done to him by the very institution that was now deciding his fate. Both of those things are true at the same time, and that is exactly what makes this story one of the most complicated cases in Florida's modern history. Because justice, real justice, is supposed to account for the full truth, not just part of it. The question this case leaves behind is whether the full truth was ever given the chance it deserved. That question does not have a simple answer, and in the next part of this story, we are going to look even deeper at what the courts said, what they didn't say, and at a broader pattern in Florida's history with the death penalty that puts everything we've covered so far into a much larger frame. Because what happened to Victor Jones did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a system with a history that the state of Florida has spent decades trying to understand, and that the rest of the country is only now beginning to pay attention to. That is what comes next. There is a number that Florida does not talk about very much. It is not a secret number. You can find it on official websites and legal databases and reports published by universities and research organizations. It has been confirmed by journalists, by courts, by advocacy groups on both sides of the death penalty debate. The number is 30 people. 30 people who were sentenced to death in the state of Florida, who sat on death row, some of them for years, some of them for decades, and who were later found to be innocent. Not probably innocent, not possibly innocent. Innocent, charges dropped, convictions overturned, evidence of innocence confirmed. 30 people who came within reach of execution for something they did not do. 30 is more than any other state in the country. Not close. More. And here's where that number begins to matter to the story of Victor Tony Jones. Because at the very same time Florida was setting its record for executions in 2025, moving faster than it had ever moved before, the same state also held this record for wrongful convictions. One innocent person cleared for roughly every 3 people executed since 1976. That means somewhere in the machinery of Florida's justice system something has gone wrong. Not once, not twice, 30 times. And yet, in 2025, that machinery was moving faster than ever. To understand how we got here, we have to understand one very unusual thing about Florida's death penalty system that is different from almost every other state in America. In most states, the decision about when to schedule an execution involves multiple people, courts, review boards. legal processes with checks built in. In Florida, that decision belongs to one person, a governor. One person, whoever sits in that office, holds the power to sign a death warrant, set a date, and put the process in motion. No court has to agree first. No committee has to approve it. The governor decides, and the date is set. For most of Governor Ron DeSantis' time in office, he used that power sparingly. From 2020 through 2022, Florida carried out no executions at all. In 2023, he signed 6 warrants, the most since he took office. In 2024, he signed one. And then came 2025. In 2025, something changed dramatically. From February through December of that year, Florida executed someone roughly every 16 days. By the time September 30th arrived, the day Victor Jones was executed, Florida had already carried out 13 executions. That was more than the previous modern-era record for an entire year. And Florida was not done. By the end of 2025, 19 people had been executed in that single calendar year. 19. The previous record, set more than 40 years earlier, was 8. Florida's 2025 execution total accounted for roughly 40% of every execution carried out in the entire United States that year. One state. 4 out of every 10 executions in the whole country. No other state had seen numbers like that since Texas in 2009. When reporters asked Governor DeSantis why the pace had accelerated so dramatically, he pointed to the families of murder victims. He said there is a saying, "Justice delayed is justice denied." He said he felt he owed it to victims' families to make sure the process moved forward. He said that seeing the weight lifted from those families after decades of waiting was what drove him. Critics looked at the same set of facts and came to a different conclusion. They pointed out that DeSantis' turn as governor was ending, that he had run for president in 2023 and lost, that the sharp increase in executions began right around the time his remaining time in office started to run short. They said, the only thing that changed is politics. One legal advocacy director said it plainly. The only explanation that fits the pattern is that the governor figured out this issue appeals to his political supporters. Governor DeSantis did not respond to many of those specific questions. What he did say, publicly, at press conferences, was that he viewed capital punishment as the only appropriate response to the very worst crimes, that some offenses are so serious that no other sentence fits, that the appeals process in America had grown too long, and that his job was to see justice carried out. There are people who agree with that view. There are people who disagree with it strongly. But here is the fact that sits at the center of that debate, and that neither side can fully dismiss. Florida has the most wrongful convictions from death row in the country. At the same time, it was executing people faster than any state in more than a generation. Those two facts exist side by side. And inside that broader story, there was Victor Jones. His case was not the only one that raised difficult questions in 2025. Another man, David Pittman, was executed in September of that same year. Pittman had a well-documented history of intellectual disabilities going back decades. Under a Supreme Court ruling from 2002, people with intellectual disabilities are constitutionally protected from execution. The law says you cannot do it. But the Florida Supreme Court had reversed an earlier ruling that would have protected Pittman. They decided that the ban on executing people with intellectual disabilities did not apply to cases that had already been finalized. Pittman had been awaiting a full hearing on his disability claims when he was executed. Jones, as we have already seen, had his own intellectual disability claims that were also rejected. Both men were executed within weeks of each other. Legal observers across the country took notice. A report published by the Death Penalty Information Center at the end of 2025 documented what it called several troubling patterns among those executed in Florida that year. Veterans, people with mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities, people whose cases contained unresolved legal questions at the time of execution. The report also raised something else, something that had been filed in federal court and was drawing attention from legal scholars. Questions about the drugs. Florida uses a 3-drug combination for lethal injection that no other state in the country uses. Court filings from late 2025 presented evidence that in 4 executions, one of the drugs used had already passed its expiration date. That in 2 executions the required dosages had not been correctly administered. That in at least 1 case a drug had been injected into soft tissue rather than a vein. United States Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor reviewed these filings and wrote that she was deeply troubled by the allegations. That is not a phrase judges use lightly. She used it, and yet the executions continued. Step back for a moment from the legal arguments and the political debates. Step back and look at what the state of Florida was doing in 2025 from a distance. On one hand, it was moving faster than any state in decades to carry out executions that the governor and many supporters said were long overdue. On the other hand, it held the national record for sending innocent people to death row. On one hand, its legislature had unanimously passed a law in 2024 recognizing that it had abused and harmed hundreds of boys in its reform school system, boys who had been in its care and its custody under its legal responsibility. On the other hand, 53 days after sending one of those boys, now a 64-year-old man, a check and a letter calling him an official victim, it executed him. And on one hand, the Florida governor held the sole power to sign death warrants, a power no court could block, no committee could override. On the other hand, that same governor held the power to commute a death sentence, to reduce it, to say this case is complicated enough, the questions unresolved enough, that we should choose life instead of death. That power had been used 6 times since 1972, 6 times in over 50 years. Governor DeSantis did not use it for Victor Jones. He did not use it for David Pittman. He did not use it for any of the 19 people executed in 2025. The Florida Catholic Conference, the organization representing the Catholic bishops of the state, wrote a letter to the governor every single time he signed a death warrant in 2025. Every single time. Each letter carried the same message. Please reconsider. Please choose a different path. There is a better way to pursue justice. The governor is Catholic. He attends Mass. He has spoken publicly about his faith. He did not respond to the letters. Michael Sheedy, the executive director of the Florida Catholic Conference, said something that became one of the more quoted lines of that year. He said, "On many issues the governor and the bishops are aligned, but on this issue the governor is out of step, not with activists, not with opponents, with his own church. Now here is the piece of this story that connects all of these threads, the record executions, the exonerations, the Okeechobee School, the 53 days, into something that demands a real answer. The American legal system operates on a principle that most people, if asked, would say they believe in. The principle is this: justice must be fair, it must be consistent, and it must account for the full truth, not just the parts that are convenient or easy. For Victor Jones, the full truth included a crime, a terrible crime. 2 people were killed, their family suffered, their daughter still carries that loss. The full truth also included what happened to him as a child, what the state of Florida, the same state that was now executing him, had done to him in those reform schools, what his original lawyers had failed to tell the jury that sentenced him to die. The question that many legal observers were left with, the question that one dissenting justice had quietly put on the record, and that scholars and lawyers and advocates were writing about in the weeks that followed his execution, was not whether Victor Jones was guilty. He was guilty. That was not in dispute. The question was whether the process that led to his death sentence had been fair, whether a jury that heard only part of his story, that never heard about Okeechobee, about the leather strap, about the solitary confinement, about what a government institution had done to a boy who was already vulnerable, could be said to have made a fully informed decision. Whether a sentence of death based on an incomplete picture is truly justice or something else. There is a woman named Irene Fisher who has thought about these questions longer than almost anyone. She is the daughter of Matilda and Jacob Nestor. She was inside the prison on September 30th, 2025. She watched Victor Jones die. And afterward she said something that very few people expected from a woman who had waited 35 years for that moment. She said she forgave him. She said she was happy it was over, and she was sad that someone else had to lose their life. She said she wished her parents could have gone as peacefully. That is not the statement of a person who found simple comfort in what happened. That is not the statement of someone for whom everything became clear and resolved. It is the statement of someone who has been living inside a complicated truth for a very long time, and she has earned the right to feel everything she described feeling. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a story that cannot be neatly wrapped up. A story that does not offer an easy answer or a clean conclusion or a moment where you can say, yes, everything worked out the way it should have. It leaves us with a 64-year-old man who died on a Tuesday evening in September in a prison near a small town in northern Florida after 32 years on death row. It leaves us with a state that broke its own execution record that night and kept going. It leaves us with the Okeechobee School for boys, still standing, still a part of the landscape, and with the hundreds of men who passed through its doors as children and who never fully left. It leaves us with a letter, dated January 2025, official, signed, stamped, recognizing Victor Tony Jones as a victim of state-sanctioned abuse. And it leaves us with a question that will not go away no matter how many courts decline to answer it, no matter how many warrants are signed, no matter how many dates are set. The question is, what do we owe to the truth? All of it, not just the part that is easy to hear. That question does not belong only to Florida. It belongs to all of us. And in the final part of this story, we are going to sit with it. We are going to look at what this case left behind, in courtrooms and conversations, in the lives of the people most directly touched by it. And we are going to ask what, if anything, changes because of it, because stories like this one do not end at 6:13 in the evening on September 30th. They keep going, and they deserve to be heard. There's one more thing about Victor Jones' trial that we have not yet talked about. One more detail that, once you hear it, changes the shape of the entire story. When the jury that sentenced Victor Jones to death made their decision in 1993, they did not all agree. 10 of them voted for death in the killing of Matilda Nestor. 2 of them said no. For the killing of Jacob Nestor, the vote was unanimous, 12-0. But for Matilda, the woman everyone called Dolly, 2 members of that jury looked at everything they had been shown, considered everything they had been told, and voted against the death penalty. 2 people in that room believed the answer should be something other than death. Under the rules at the time, that was enough. 10 out of 12 was sufficient, and so the death sentence stood. Now here is why that matters in a way that goes far beyond just this one case. In most of the United States, if you are going to sentence someone to death, every single person on the jury has to agree, all 12. If even one person says no, 1 person out of 12, the sentence cannot be death. That is the standard in 49 states that have the death penalty. Florida is not one of them. Florida, as of 2023, allows a death sentence to be recommended by just 8 out of 12 jurors. 4 people on a jury can say, "We do not believe this person should die," and it does not matter. The other 8 can outvote them, and a person can be sent to death row with 4 members of their own jury disagreeing, 8 out of 12. That is the lowest standard of any state in the entire country. And here is what makes that number important beyond just a legal debate. Of the 30 people who have been exonerated from Florida's death row, 30 people found to be innocent after being sentenced to death. 97% of them were convicted under non-unanimous jury decisions. 97%. Nearly every single one, which means that the non-unanimous system is not just a philosophical disagreement about how justice should work. It is a system that, by its own track record, has been sending innocent people to death row at a rate that is hard to explain away. Victor Jones was not innocent. That is not the argument being made here. He was convicted unanimously. All 12 jurors agreed he was guilty. That part of the process was not in question. But his death sentence for the murder of Matilda Nestor was not unanimous. 2 people in that room said no. Under the law as it existed in 1993, that was not enough to save him. And under the law as it exists today, it would be even easier to sentence someone to death over the objections of multiple jurors. The system has moved in one direction, and one direction only, toward making it easier to sentence people to death. Not harder, easier. And this happened not because of some quiet legal change that nobody noticed. It happened publicly in the Florida legislature in response to a single high-profile case, the Parkland school shooting. The jury that voted not to execute the shooter. After that verdict, Governor DeSantis and the legislature changed the rules. They lowered the bar, a law that critics immediately called unconstitutional, a law that advocates warned would result in more wrongful convictions. A law that one legal organization said at the time was almost certainly going to plunge the system and victims' families into decades of additional uncertainty and chaos. And the law passed anyway, and it was signed into effect. And it stands today. Now step all the way back. Look at everything together. Florida has the most death row exonerations in the country, more than any other state. And it moved to make it easier, not harder, to send someone to death row. Florida officially acknowledged, by unanimous vote of its own legislature, that it had abused and traumatized hundreds of boys in state-run reform schools over several decades. It set aside $20 million in compensation. It sent official letters. It used the word victim. And then it executed one of those victims. Florida has a system where a single governor, one person, holds the power to sign a death warrant and set an execution date, with no court approval required. And in 2025, that governor used that power at a pace the country had not seen in more than a generation. Florida used a 3-drug execution combination that no other state uses, with documented questions about drug expiration dates and dosage accuracy that drew the written concern of a United States Supreme Court justice. And Florida executed 4 people who faced their final moments without legal representation that most lawyers would consider adequate, including one man whose attorney had not visited him in more than a decade. All of this happened in a single year, not scattered across a decade, not across different administrations, in 1 year, in 2025. So what do we do with all of that? What does a person do after hearing all of this with the weight of it? There are people who look at these facts and come to one conclusion. They say the system worked. Criminals who were convicted by juries and sentenced according to the law were finally brought to justice after too many years of delay. The families of victims were given the closure they deserved. The law was applied. There are people who look at the same facts and come to a very different conclusion. They say a system that has sent 30 innocent people to death row is a system that cannot be trusted to move this fast. That speed and justice are not the same thing. That when you are wrong in a case like this, there is no going back. Both of those positions are held by real people with real reasons. Judges and lawyers and professors and families of murder victims and survivors of wrongful convictions. Smart, thoughtful people who have looked at the same evidence and reached different places. This documentary does not tell you which of them is right. That is not its job. Its job is to make sure you have the full picture, not just part of it, because here is what most news coverage of an execution looks like. A paragraph about the crime, a paragraph about the conviction, a sentence about the execution, a quote from a family member, the end. Victor Jones, on the night of his death, received slightly more than that. A few news articles, a protest by 60 people outside the gates, a statement from an advocacy group. And then the world moved on, but the questions his case raised did not move on with it. They are still there, sitting in court documents and legal briefs and official government letters. In the official record of the Florida Attorney General's office, where a letter exists, signed and stamped calling Victor Jones a victim of the state of Florida. In the account of a woman named Irene Fisher, who watched the man who killed her parents die, and said she forgave him, and said she was sad that someone else had to lose their life. In the testimony of men now in their 70s and 80s who were boys once, boys sent to schools with names on buildings and rules in handbooks, and who came out carrying things no child should ever have to carry. Their stories did not end with Victor Jones. They were never just about Victor Jones. Here is something that does not appear in most of the reporting on this case. Victor Jones was not the only person executed in 2025 who had been officially recognized as a survivor of Florida's reform school abuse. A man named Michael Bell was also executed that year. He too had been sent to the Dozier School as a boy. He too had been formally recognized by the state as a victim. He too was executed in 2025. 2 men, both officially recognized by the state of Florida as victims of abuse the state itself had committed. Both executed by the same state in the same year. The Death Penalty Information Center documented this. It put both names in its annual report. It noted the pattern. And the pattern raised a question that nobody in official power has yet answered. If the state of Florida believes strongly enough to write it into law, strongly enough to create a $20 million fund, strongly enough to send individual letters and issue individual checks, that what happened in those schools caused serious lasting harm to the boys who passed through them. If the state believes that this harm was real and permanent and worthy of official recognition and financial compensation, then does that same state believe that harm is relevant to who those boys became as men? Does it believe it is relevant to the decisions they made as adults? Does it believe that a jury should have been told about it before sentencing one of them to die? The Florida Supreme Court said no, 5-1. The United States Supreme Court said nothing at all. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be said out loud. Victor Tony Jones was on Florida's death row for 32 years. During those 32 years, he appealed his sentence multiple times. He raised questions about his lawyers, about his mental capacity, about what the jury was and was not told. He filed legal documents and sat through hearings and waited for decisions that kept coming back the same way. No, no, no. During those same 32 years, he was also, by every account, quiet. He did not write a book. He did not give interviews. He did not become a public figure or a cause or a symbol of anything while he was alive. He was just a man waiting in a cell for 32 years. And when the moment finally came when he was asked if he had any last thing to say, he chose silence. 2 words. That was all. No, sir. Maybe that silence was resignation. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe after 32 years he had simply run out of things to say to a world that had stopped listening a long time ago. We don't know. We will never know. But we can choose not to treat his silence the same way the system treated it. We can ask the questions his case leaves behind. We can look at the full picture, not just the crime, not just the conviction, not just the execution, but everything. The school, the leather strap, the letter, the 53 days, the 2 jurors who said no, the 30 innocent people, the record-breaking year, the 1 justice who quietly disagreed. All of it because that is what it means to actually reckon with something. Not to decide in advance what the answer is, not to pick a side and ignore the rest, but to look at the whole truth as honestly as you can and sit with what it tells you. Victor Tony Jones was executed on September 30th, 2025. He was 64 years old. He had spent more than half his life on death row. He was guilty of killing 2 people. He was also, by the official determination of the state that killed him, a victim. Both of those things are true. And somewhere in the space between them, in that uncomfortable, unresolved space, lives the real story of American justice. Not the clean version. Not the simple version. The real one. If this story made you think, if it raised questions you are still sitting with, then this video did what it was supposed to do. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this case stayed with you the most. And if you want to keep going deeper on stories that the headlines don't tell you the whole truth about, you know what to do. The stories that matter most are the ones that don't have easy answers. This was one of them. Thank you for watching.